aliens are reported in a different way. Aliens in the sort of 70s, like I said, in Britain, they tended to look more like astronauts in spacesuits and had breathing apparatus, whereas later aliens can be sort of greys or reptoids or insectoids, praying mantis-like creatures. What worries me is that ultra-terrestrial is just another label for what we used to call an alien, and the super spectrum is, or other dimension, is just another term for, something coming from outer space. I spoke to somebody recently and she said a couple saw an entity. Her husband said he saw a spaceman, but the wife saw an angel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to WatchMojo's Unveiled Podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and before we dive into today's episode, this is your reminder that Unveiled is available on all podcast platforms. So check us out wherever you like to listen to podcasts, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else. Unveiled is available. Leave us a rating and a review, and it really helps us out. My guest today is Nigel Watson. Nigel is a prominent UFO researcher, author, and columnist who has been investigating UFO sightings and encounters since the 1970s. And his book, Portraits of Alien Encounters Revisited, is an in-depth exploration of high strangeness UFO cases stemming primarily from Northern England in the 1970s and beyond. He joins me today to discuss all of that and perhaps some connections to more modern UFO cases and the disclosure narrative that's currently unfolding. Nigel, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So you have called the 1970s the golden age of ufology. Why is that? What made the 70s so special?
It's because in Britain in particular, we become more aware of abduction cases, and the Betty and Barney Hill case had obviously been a big influence in the 1960s. And then in the early 70s, there's like the Travis Walton case and a few other cases in America. And that had a certain influence on Britain. But mainly there were cases of people encountering UFOs and aliens, and that seemed to be quite a common instance in the 1970s, far more than the 50s and 60s. And also there were a lot of British UFO magazines and organisations then. So if you look in the old magazines or old catalogues of cases, you'll find sort of close encounters of a third kind being quite regular, at least 4 or 5 a year, and there's probably more if you do a bit more digging. And compared to, say, the sort of the 2000s onwards, there's virtually no close encounters of a third kind. I think there's about one I can think of that happened in Exmouth in Devon. I think a man was walking his dog and saw a UFO, but that was nearby, and a humanoid, I think. But these sort of cases are fairly rare now, and so it's sort of interesting. I don't know whether a lot of information has gone online or people just don't report these things, in the same ways we used to do. But with me, I started interviewing people about lights in the sky and that sort of thing, just in my local area in Scunthorpe. And then near the end of the 70s, as like Close Encounters of a Third Kind was released in the cinemas. And that meant lots of people took that opportunity to kind of report older cases and anything that had happened recently. But a lot of it was people reporting things that had happened in retrospect. And Jenny Randall's organised a lot of the distribution of these cases, because she ran the Northern UFO Network, which was an alliance of like Northern English UFO groups. So she used to pass on quite a lot of these cases to me if it were sort of roughly in my area. And that's briefly how I kind of got to interview people that are in my book. But a lot of the cases I wrote up for was for the Merseyside UFO Bulletin, that later become Begonia. and that push for sort of psychological and sociological aspect of UFO sightings. So I kind of pursued that pathway really, rather than trying to prove anything was extraterrestrial or nuts and bolts craft. I just collected information about what people reported to me, and I didn't really want to pigeonhole it. But I think at that time it just seemed to be a lot more cases, whereas nowadays everything's on social media, and it's probably got more compartmentalized because there are so many different forums and things like TikTok and Facebook and X and everything. So it kind of, although there's more information out there, I think it's got more fragmented. Whereas, probably like in Britain, there were so many UFO organizations that were promoted in local newspapers, so they'd be able to pick up information on a local basis. And then you had people like Jenny Randalls who kind of coordinated our activities. And she used to produce a sort of monthly magazine. I think it's archived online. And you just have to flick through that, and nearly every month there's a close encounter case. That's far more interesting than a lot of stuff you get nowadays. So, I think I don't know whether, if there is a sort of phenomenon out there, whether that's changed its characteristics, or just that the way we report and collect data has changed over time. So, I think with my book, I've just tried to collate everything I'd done in the sort of 70s and early 80s, but it does come a bit up to date with fairly recent cases that are in similar areas and have kind of continued the kind of bloodline of experiences, really. But, I just find it interesting, though, as well, that you can compare it with American cases, because a lot of these cases aren't of abductions as such, which was very popular with Bud Hopkins and other researchers in the sort of 80s and 90s. But we were kind of prototype alien abductions. There's one case I mentioned of a man who sort of thought he was going to be beamed up onto a spacecraft, but for some reason it didn't work, and so he kind of found himself back on Earth. And it's only later I've got some accounts of kind of classic abductions. There's one case of a person who said he'd felt a beam of light on him when he was quite young in his bed, and then found himself on an examination table. So that was a kind of classic, abduction case. And there's another one of Paula Green, and she said she found herself in a kind of molded room and was showing a screen showing a kind of earthly paradise that quickly turns into a kind of apocalypse. Everything goes bad. And that's another theme of alien abductions. People are often shown a screen and shown like the history of humanity and what might happen to us if we don't mend our ways. And it's quite interesting how even Paula doesn't say these are kind of alien abductions. She just says she's kind of taken and finds herself in a different place. So she's not saying aliens did it. And so in a way, she just says these things happened to me, and she's not really binding it to the alien thing. I don't think she really even likes the word, alien, really, because she thinks it's or using that word is already colouring her experience. And I think that's a kind of ethos of my book. I've not tried to colour it by any, rigid theory about spaceships or any other theory, really. I do mention things like false memory syndrome and sleep paralysis. But I think I'm kind of leaving it to other people to apply that kind of knowledge and research to my material, because I think in a way you can quite easily put labels on things, and by doing so you miss out a lot of other information. And I think just having the term sleep paralysis is a good way of just labeling a vast section of abduction cases. And it's a bit of a lazy way of addressing the subject. And I think it helps kind of debunkers of just say, well, alien abductions are nonsense, and we'll slap the sleep paralysis label on them, and then we can sort of push them away. And I think the subject's more complex than that. I think each case has to be examined on its merits. So I don't think it's great having these kind of bland theories, whether it's aliens or just some psychological phenomenon. I think you got to kind of work a middle way and try and examine everything on their own merits, really.
That makes sense. And there's a vast array of different types of cases detailed in your book that extend way beyond aliens and UFOs. There's more paranormal events, things like the Liverpool Leprechauns case, which was kind of like a mass hysteria event. Lots of different things. And I can see the cover of your book behind you, Portraits of Alien Encounters Revisited. Before we get into the specific cases in more depth, I'd like to know why you thought it was important to update your book, which was originally published in the 90s, for a modern audience.
Yeah, I felt the book needed revising because there's some information in there I thought I needed to take out. It didn't seem that relevant. There's like 2 or 3 chapters where there's a bit of a discussion between myself and Norman Harrison, who was a contactee, but it kind of degenerated into a bit of bickering about how I said this and I said that. And in a way, we agreed to disagree. And I thought, in a way, it seemed a bit surplus to the rest of the book. And I wanted to fit in more about things like the Liverpool Leprechauns and the social panics that were created. Usually, these were involving children who seemed to be very predominant in the UFO subject. In the 70s, there was a Broadhaven flap of cases, and there's a Broadhaven school where children said they saw UFO land near the playground, and some of them said they saw an entity coming out of it. And there's a bit of argy-bargy about what they actually saw, but as far as I know, no adults actually saw this craft, even if it was nearby. And I mentioned other cases where children in playgrounds have seen UFOs. There's one in particular I mentioned from a school near Hull, and a child was in the playground and he saw a flying saucer land on a flat school roof, and a sort of alien in a gold spacesuit with no arms came out of it and sort of walked around the roof and was connected to the UFO by tubing as if it had breathing apparatus. But none of the other children saw this. And, I suppose people would say it was his imagination. But this seems to happen a lot in school playgrounds. Either one child sees something or no group of them do. And I think in the case of the Liverpool Leprechauns, it was so groups of children in parks in Liverpool said they saw a little leprechaun throwing clods of dirt at them and wearing, the classic leprechaun type hat. And the kind of Liverpool newspaper mentions that there were sightings of a UFO coming over from Ireland to Merseyside. And so it was kind of connecting the leprechauns with UFOs. But I don't know if the newspaper was actually doing that as a tongue-in-cheek fashion, really, because it didn't really elaborate much on the sighting. And also the the description of the leprechauns is a bit varied, and it's a bit confusing because although people do remember being at these sort of schoolyard panic sort of, a lot of them just remember it was quite chaotic and that they didn't actually see anything, but other children did. So I think it's a kind of classic case of rumours and a kind of panic that went through groups of children, and that's not a rare occurrence. You find throughout the world there are cases of children seeing UFOs in the playground, and some of them. There's one in South Africa that was investigated by Johnny Mack in Zimbabwe, which is a famous one. But there's always a bit of a dispute over the descriptions and whether the children were really separated enough not to contaminate each other's accounts, or whether people were, trying to reach a kind of consensus of what they saw. And I think that's another problem with multi-witness sightings. If you don't get their report straight away, they kind of get filtered into being one kind of similarity of description. And so in a way, I wanted my book to include those sort of cases to fit in with a Paul Bennett case. There's a sort of teenage UFO witness I investigated in my original book. And is quite an intriguing person because he's quite intelligent and he had a group of friends, but he saw things like a 12-foot high robot at a reservoir near his home, and he and a friend also saw a little mini man in black, and so he had lots of paranormal experiences, and so I thought that fitted in quite well with other cases of children having these encounters. I think it's interesting that sightings are often reported by children, or people remember childhood experiences. I think perhaps it's because children are more open to new experiences, where an adult might just glimpse something and just explain it away. Children are kind of often very curious. Paul Bennett was very curious and wanted to know what was going on, really. And he was inspired by the works of John Keel, who put forward the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. So he's just an interesting person to talk to, and had lots of different, really strange experiences.
Your book explores both the extraterrestrial hypothesis and the psychological hypothesis. And I like how you don't take a stance really leaning toward one or the other, but do you find it difficult to balance both perspectives when dealing with cases like this?
Originally, I supported the extraterrestrial hypothesis because that seemed like the most credible, really. We'd already developed spacecraft, so why shouldn't advanced civilizations do the same? But I think people like John Keel and quite a few writers in Britain and in Europe sort of disputed how solid this evidence was. Was said about the lack of physical evidence. It was always very intangible. Even now, if people come up with fragments of UFOs that tend to be very uninspiring, that tend to be like molten rock or something like that, or not very technological or that much different from human metals. So the lack of really solid physical evidence sort of led people to think a lot of these sightings are more like ghosts and related to more like paranormal experiences. And I think that's what I came across when you interview a UFO witness. They might not think these other experiences are related, but if you speak to them, you'll find out they often do have a lot of psychic experiences and lots of other things that have happened through their life, and often we don't equate it with a UFO sighting. And so I think that's quite an interesting aspect of the subject that people like John Keel came up with. But what worries me though is like he came up with the term ultra-terrestrial, and that they came from another dimension and move through the super spectrum, so that we could come from their dimension into our dimension and then move out of it again. But what worries me is that ultra-terrestrial is just another label for what we used to call an alien, and the super spectrum is, or other dimension, is just another term for, something coming from outer space. It doesn't really solve a problem, it merely gives it new names. And it also worries me that the psychic dimension of a paranormal one is like they're quite intangible subjects on their own, like there's no real evidence of ghosts or poltergeists or anything, they're still up in the air and being researched. So you're just lumping a lot of intangibles together. and then with UFOs, it's quite handy because the term flying saucer or UFO or unidentified anomalous phenomenon is a good umbrella term to chuck all this stuff into. But, what is it? Is it because there are things or entities out there, with so-called non-human intelligences, or is it all in our own minds? Are we creating it within ourselves? Is it our own psychology? Sleep paralysis does explain certain cases of bedroom encounters, but there's far more complex cases, people having long-term alien communications and doing automatic writing and paintings based on their kind of impressions from aliens. So it's very hard sort of finding an explanation that helps us come to terms with a subject. I think we just have to acknowledge that there's lots of things going on here, and you can't just say, oh, it's alien or it's ultra-terrestrial or it's a new terminology. In fact, the new terminology is just rebranding what we've already had in the past, But I think with Project Blue Book made flying saucers into unidentified flying objects, UFOs, so give it a more respectable name, but it was the same topic really.
And now it's changed to UAP, another shift, which we're talking about essentially the same thing, but it's just framed differently to kind of relieve some of the stigma that got attached to that term over the decades.
Also, the non-human intelligence is a pretty ambiguous term as well, and I think we tried to bring in the fact that there could be psychic weaponry or that sort of thing, that things are influenced in witnesses due to the UAP. There's a British study on UFOs commissioned by the Ministry of Defence at the end of the late 1990s, Project Condign, and that's recommended that the MOD didn't bother studying UFOs anymore, but it did come to the conclusion that rare plasma-like phenomenon could affect vehicles and and interact with humans to make them believe they've had alien contact of some kind. So we did open the door to some rare phenomenon out there interacting with us and the technology, but we didn't think it was any threat to national security or anything. And there was that worry that other nations could utilize such plasma and then use it, weaponize it really. And I think that's something that's in the UAP debate really. I think a lot of the push in the American Congress is to say, well, if they're not aliens or whatever, they still pose a threat to the United States airspace. and that, we should be studied just because they've garnered so much interest and publicity. And we also had the episode with the Chinese balloons coming over the United States and being shot down. So that was another element of this UAP thing, and that aerial objects can visit other countries and be a danger. So there is that sort of hostile threat from secret inventions or spy vehicles of any kind. So I think it's legitimate that a nation like the United States should study this phenomenon, but I think you can kind of get a bit too carried away with it being an exotic phenomenon. With my book, it does cover a lot of exotic phenomenon, but I'm not trying to say it's some sort of non-human intelligence out there. I'm kind of leaving it open to different explanations. I think it's just good if we could get to the bottom of what and why such things are reported, like Paul Bennett and other children. Why are they seeing things like flying saucers now, whereas in the past they might have seen, the Virgin Mary or religious visitations in the past. So I think there is that element of our society and culture, shaping what people report. I spoke to somebody recently and she said a couple saw an entity. My husband said he saw a spaceman, but the wife saw an angel. So I think there's that thing about how people perceive things. And I think that's a fascinating thing about my book and the subject in general, is our own perception of things that we aren't able to explain. And our perceptions are governed by lots of different factors. Even as a UFO investigator, we were shaped by the fact that there was an ETH explanation, and then John Kill's Ultra-terrestrials, which kind of morphed into the psychosociological hypothesis, where it said it's all our society, our culture, and our own psychological perception of things. So, you could say a lot of that does condition us, but is it cause of everything, or is it something out there as well? Like I said about plasma energy or geophysical forces of some kind, these could impact on us as well. So I think the whole subject does leave us open to lots of things to explore. And, I think it's easy for things to just put a label on the subject, either in a dismissive way, or you can just go down the rabbit hole of believing everything. So I think you've got to be got to be open-minded, but not go too mad in either direction. And I think that's been my main guiding principle.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought up the investigations that are being conducted in government settings, especially in the United States right now. But one question I have is that it seems like most of the information that they're presenting and looking at is military sensor data, eyewitness testimonies from pilots and other military personnel. Are they missing a part of the picture by leaving out personal accounts or experience or accounts such as those that are detailed in your book? Do you think that there's a part of the equation that's missing from the investigations that are happening now?
Yeah, I think they do highlight any video footage by pilots and pilot testimony and military testimony, and there does seem to be clusters of sightings around nuclear and military facilities. But I'm not sure that's because people are more aware of security issues near such locations. So people would be more sensitive to seeing odd lights in the sky if they live near a sensitive military base, rather than people away from such places who might just have similar sightings, or it might be the activities at these bases that could trigger sightings. Aircraft often do cause people to report UFO sightings. But I think it's interesting, though, with all this latest congressional hearing material, there's little talk of alien abductions that were all the rage years ago. And but there is sort of bubbling underneath the surface talk of these non-human intelligences, and people, even military people, have seen things and then been psychologically influenced by them. There's a Rendlesham Forest case where an American serviceman said he received binary code from the craft that they came close to. And I'm not too convinced by that, but there is a lot of material about people being affected by UAPs and getting strange feelings, and there's a Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon of people getting kind of ghostly ghostly things following them home, and lots of psychic things going on there. But I think generally presenting that sort of material to Congress is a bit much, really, because I think the government, if it is persuaded to study the subject more, it would be more convinced by the threat from foreign sources, like highly advanced technology perfected by foreign countries. I think there is quite a push to try and include some really strange experiences in amongst that data, but I don't think it's very helpful, really. And I think in a way we have to understand of a wider context of the subject, because back in the 1950s there was massive UFO flaps. Washington in 1952 had a massive UFO wave, and UFOs were spotted on radar, and there's kind of wave of sightings throughout the country, and it encouraged the CIA to look at the matter and decide that we should suppress UFO sightings because there were overwhelming intelligence channels, and they wanted clear data on any foreign missiles coming in towards the country, whereas UFO sightings could cause a lot of clutter. So they encouraged Project Blue Book to debunk most UFO cases, and they'd also, even when we were really into investigating cases, they tended to bin anything that mentioned close encounters of a third kind or any contactee type material, because they wanted to just look at what they thought was the more scientifically valid sort of cases that can be studied, and to see if there was anything extraterrestrial out there or something that threatened American security. So in a way, in particular, America has gone through this in the 50s, and we had Donald Kehoe talking about disclosure and trying to put pressure on the government to release files and everything. And we're still getting that nowadays. We're going through the whole thing of like the New Jersey drone wave of sightings at the end of last year, and we're getting pressure to try and disclose what the government knows. But I think I'm critical of what does the government really know, because the government's composed of lots of different agencies and civilian contractors. So you have to ask yourself, who are you going to try and prize data off, and is it what we're really looking for? Are we looking for um, something that might not even exist? Because what is disclosure? Is it finding alien bodies, or is it finding reverse engineered craft in Area 51? What does disclosure amount to? And it's always like, even the president doesn't know about it because it's a secret level above a presidential level. It's always like, what, even of these whistleblowers, if they do know something, they say, well, we can't say because of national security. And that's a two-edged sword, because in a way, perhaps they can't say what they saw or knew or anything, because it would be a risk to national security. But on the other hand, it does hide the fact that, was it genuinely a sort of alien, or was it just something else that would release information related to government secrets? So, it's one of these things where it's very frustrating as outsiders, because, we're saying, oh, there's all this evidence, but whenever it's presented, it's always very hard to determine if it is pure evidence. We've had these United States Navy videos, with um, gimbal and the other videos, and the trouble is they're in infrared, so we're not even very clear. You'd think with advanced aircraft you could actually get clear HD footage of them. You can get that from a dashboard camera, so why can't a dashboard camera on a jet interceptor show something better than the kind of material we've had? Like yesterday's hearing, they came up with a missile being shot at a UFO, and and nothing happening to this UFO, but it's not really clear footage. And I'm sure, some people would debate the fact about whether it was something actually solid out there, or, it could be something like, I think, something further away from how we might imagine that object to be. We've had cases like that before, where pilots have tried to intercept the planet Venus, or a balloon that's miles away, because you've got no perspective. So something could look big and bright from a pilot's point of view, could actually be really small and very far away but very bright, or something dull. Dull could be really close to them, whereas you might think it's far away. So you've got unless you've got instrumental support or radar, it's very difficult to determine how far something is away. And these videos aren't really helpful. They're just like, they remind me of a ghostly videos you get in these haunted programs where, why do they hunt for ghosts in the dark with infrared goggles and everything? And, and that's just the same with UFOs. You kind of have to hunt for UFOs using, goggles and infrared sensors, but you can never you'd think you'd be able to get decent pictures of them. And I think that's the difference between kind of UAPs and the Chinese balloons incident we had, where they did actually get sightings of these things by people on the ground, and aircraft actually intercepted them, and we actually shot them down. So, and people actually took pictures of these things as well. Whereas with UFOs, it's always like short glimpses of these things. Even the Tic Tac sightings by pilots have been kind of short-lived. And, we've also said that at one time we were seeing these things every day, but you think if we were seeing that sort of thing, surely that would be some great national threat, and that, would be able to pin down what the hell these things were. But it never seems to happen, and I think that's the problem with the UFO subject really, and this idea of disclosure. I think we're on to a hiding for nothing if we try and pursue that, because first you have to determine, what disclosure is. And, some people have said, well, we've already had disclosure. In fact, we have released these facts or whatever, and we just have to kind of believe that these things are going on behind closed doors or whatever. But, from my point of view, it's just a bit of a, it gets a lot of mainstream attention. There's all these bombshell announcements, but nothing ever seems to come out of them.
Do you think it's done deliberately that the videos that are released are open to a wide interpretation and not, not the clearest footage? There's,
Yeah.
as you said, issues with perspective. Do you think that that's a conscious thing, that's the type of content that's being released to the public?
I suppose in a way you could say it's softening up the public, because these videos did get a lot of attention and are still, famous, and people who never knew anything about UFOs suddenly saw these on their TV screens. And so in a way, I think they're a good thing for bringing the subject into a wider mainstream acknowledgement, really. And I think, the old disclosure movement has made the subject far more accessible and less of a laughing stock. I think the subject was really kind of dying off by the 2000s. We'd had the X-Files, and the millennium came and went, and then it kind of went through a bit of a quiet period. So releasing these videos have brought it to public attention. And although there's a lot of whistleblowers and different information and things about reverse engineering, there again, a lot of it doesn't match up. These stories seem to come from different directions, and it's really hard to get hold of any solid information. And you wonder, sometimes the government or different agencies have used UFOs to hide their own secret projects, like the U-2 spy planes might have, the CIA says, caused quite a lot of UFO sightings by pilots in the 1960s. And so in a way, UFOs are a good way of kind of covering up, terrestrial activities. And so I think, like I was saying, really, but you can't just look at the subject from just one point of view. You've got to look at different perspectives, really, and viewpoints. And I'm just not convinced by the disclosure movement, really. And also I think organizations like NASA have actually set up UFO study groups, and I think it's a good thing. Them and quite a few other sort of civilian UFO groups are setting up sensors to track or identify UFOs, because I think if you want to try and get solid evidence, at least set up systems to look for. I think, as NASA acknowledged, a lot of these things are really elusive, and so it's really hard unless you can find a kind of UFO hotspot and set up your equipment there. It's always going to evade you. And that happened, I think, in the kind of New Mexico area in the sort of 1947. There were these mysterious green fireballs that were seen. And an astronomer went there with a little group of people with equipment to try and track these green fireballs, but I think they've failed to actually track any of them, and they always popped up where they weren't. It was very difficult to track these things down, and in the end the green fireballs seemed to disappear. And so I think that's another aspect of it. In fact, it's all right saying, set up tracking devices and everything, but it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. And So I suppose it's good that that kind of technology is being kind of put forward, and it might even track and find, rare meteorological phenomenon. So there's that plus side to it. And I suppose the work of Hervé Loeb, who's now promoting 31 Atlas, this interstellar object. At least it's looking for solid scientific evidence of an extraterrestrial presence of things, rather than I suppose with SETI, they were just looking for radio signals. That seemed far more respectable. You just have a big, you know, radio dish and lots of equipment and analysis. That seemed more respectable. So I think, looking at any objects coming into our solar system or trying to detect any evidence of crashes in the past, I think it's kind of useful in that you can actually scientifically get your hands on that sort of data. I'm not sure there again, it's just cashing in on the UFO bandwagon. And I suppose that's why I think it's not fantastic, but at least it could bring up lots of new information for related subjects, really. But it's like a lot of research projects in the past, they never seem to come up with anything solid, or you end up with people working in these organizations who either debunk it all, or either believe it all, and then you get factions and people saying, "Oh, that's a load of rubbish," and then others will say no because of X, Y, and Z. So it's very hard to get anything satisfactory. It's like this 31 Atlas interstellar object. A lot of people are keen on the fact it might be alien, but there's a lot of evidence to say it's nothing particularly special. And we've already had that kind of cry and wolf about other celestial objects in the solar system. So I think it's just another avenue of research, but just as my books, it shows up another avenues of where the subject takes you to.
You had mentioned previously that after the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released, there was a spike in reports of UFO sightings and
Yeah,
abduction encounters. Do you get a sense that something similar is happening now, what with the mainstream attention that the UFO topic is getting from the
yeah,
congressional hearings and whatnot? Or is it difficult to say because now we live in the age of the internet where nobody can trust anything that they see and deep fakes are all
yeah,
over the place?
yeah.
What do you think is happening now with regards to that?
Yeah, I think it's something like Spielberg's doing this disclosure film. So I think that will get a lot of excitement, because I think with Close Encounters, it incorporated lots of so-called real cases and stories from UFO mythology, if you want to call it a mythology. And this disclosure should be interesting to see how that shapes up, because I'm sure it will include a lot of what's going on today in Congress and the different, perhaps it will look at the different people involved in these hearings. And I think it will. I think fiction and drama helps clarify things that documentaries don't always show. They kind of give a skeleton, whereas a drama and film can be far more, you know, powerful, because it puts a flesh on the bones and makes you really think about something. I think like Close Encounters was fantastic because you didn't have to go out sky watching on a cold freezing night. You could just see these massive, the mothership and dancing lights. And I watched it with an audience not long after it was released, and you could, feel the energy in the room. People were really responding to what they were seeing on the screen. And I think, in a way, Spielberg might have introduced this whole concept of greys because of the spindly aliens with the big heads at the end. I think that was kind of a powerful push, so that people were then reporting similar types of entities into the sort of 1980s when abduction research became more prominent, whereas something like the Betty and Barney Hill case, they didn't see greys, they just saw aliens with, large-nosed aliens, which are more like normal human beings. So it's interesting that you kind of get fashions in ufology where, aliens are reported in a different way. Aliens in the sort of 70s, like I said, in Britain, they tended to look more like astronauts in spacesuits and had breathing apparatus, whereas later aliens can be sort of greys or reptoids or insectoids, praying mantis like creatures, but they don't have breathing apparatus and they're not like spacesuited aliens anymore. And I think that's the thing with UAPs. I think the image of a UAP is more related to kind of drone technology of these alien drones, just as Foo Fighters were related to the fact there could be secret Nazi weapons, or the ghost rockets at the end of the Second World War were related to rocket technology. So in a way, what people report seems to reflect the next step in technology, especially dealing with aeronautical developments. And I think the development of drones has kind of shaped the UAP narrative, really, so that any drone-like thing in the sky can be regarded as something mysterious and non-human. But I think, as it's been reported, there's literally thousands of people who own drones, and the military own drones, and I think they've kind of contaminated the field, really, because this, people could easily hoax cases using drones as well. So I think because they're readily on the market, they can contaminate the subject, just as AI is another thing. People can far easily, not just fake still pictures, but moving pictures. So, we've got a new chapter of kind of revelations, but also of ways of portraying the subject in a sort of without recourse to facts. And I think perhaps some people think, well, if you hoax things or pass on misinformation, it'll flush out real facts that the government will say, oh no, that's wrong, but X, Y, and Z. So there's that can of worms of what comes out of these new technologies, really, because new technology kind of helps research, but it also hinders it because it helps create false information as much as it can be used to try and dig out, genuine information.
There's a really interesting quote from your book. You say, dabbling with ufology is as dangerous as dabbling with black magic.
Right.
If that's true, then why dedicate so much time to this subject?
Well, I'm sort of fascinated by the subject because I was interested in space exploration and our place in the universe, really. And I suppose actually talking to people who have witnessed UFOs or had alien contact, makes you wonder, is there something out there? I think we all believe there are sort of intelligent aliens out there because the universe is so vast, and it's very improbable we're the only intelligent life in this sort of vast universe. But whether aliens are coming here is a different matter altogether. I think starting off looking at them as sort of possible aliens, I suppose, as space suited type aliens, and then I kind of slipped into, I suppose, what some people say of John Keel's hypothesis is it's almost like demonology. These are shape-shifting creatures that have come to us as devils and Satan and angels, and we've just changed their shape, but the nature of a beast is something that represents archetypal influences that are deep in our own psyche, if you go by the works of Carl Jung. But I think the subject can be dangerous if you go down the rabbit hole of believing things. I think we're all geared to seeing patterns. So it's easy if you start looking for certain patterns, they'll come to you. If you, like I've been writing about angels, and I keep coming across references to angels, but I suppose it's only because you're looking, angels are something not that difficult to see in books and films and stuff. But often it's a bit like if you buy a car, you never notice a car you bought until you drive around, and then you see, oh, that car looks just like mine, and then you kind of so we have this kind of pattern recognition of things. So I think sometimes, like John Keel felt he was at the center of alien intervention. He had this network of silent contactees who kept feeding him information. And I think on one occasion he thought the world was going to end, and he stopped his car up with supplies and tried to find higher ground. And I think you can get sucked into this subject, and I think that's why you need a wider perspective. And perhaps, with the old sort of magic thing, I think people in my book mention meditating and being in relaxed states and then having alien communications. And I suppose it's not much further a step for people to try and actually conjure up aliens. I think Aleister Crowley is famously known as conjuring up a kind of big-headed entity-like being in, I think, 1909 or something like that. And so there is that danger that people will dabble in magic. And I suppose another aspect of the subject is that people have used dreams and the paranormal and psychic events to go on like psychic quests looking for artifacts in the. I think you need to be more grounded rather than being, totally involved in the subject, and you can get a bit too immersed in it, really. I think it's nice if you can kind of have a wider perspective.
With regards to the abduction phenomenon in particular, how has your perspective on that changed over the years since you started investigating it?
Yeah, I think for Betty and Barney Hill case, it's really good, but it's so sort of old-fashioned as well. They were actually dragged along into the landed craft up a ramp, and Betty saw the famous star map, and I think there was a sort of technical manual that she looked at, and they kind of examined them like lab rats. But it seems very much of the kind of thing you'd expect of that period. If you look at things like the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits and different TV and films of that period, their kind of UFO encounter fits in very much like the sort of craft that are displayed in them. Whereas the later abductions, like Bud Hopkins's cases, they seem to involve people being tractor beamed almost into a flying saucer, but they're sort of levitated, through solid objects and windows, and so we kind of completely defy the law of physics. And you come up with a lot of terminology as well, like gateway amnesia. People didn't remember how they got inside the craft, but just floated up and often found themselves, on a laboratory table. And it's also interesting if you look at the work of Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs or Johnny Mack, the the kind of abductions they study all seem to be shaped by what they expect to see. Bud Hopkins was trying to promote the idea that we were like family bloodlines, that aliens were following whole generations of families. And he also felt the aliens were doing this kind of hybrid breeding program, because it spoke about women having this phantom fetus syndrome where would think they were pregnant and then suddenly they'd lose the fetus, and then they'd sometimes have an alien abduction experience where they'd meet the baby on the spacecraft, or people would see babies on the spacecraft. Whereas I think with Johnny Mack's cases, they seem to be quite different from the kind of cases Bud Hopkins looked at, and the same with David Jacobs's cases. And so in a way, there's that kind of investigator bias, I suppose. You kind of pick the cases that suit your theories. But so I think over time, I think abduction cases are the results of, some of them are sleep paralysis, where you wake up and your kind of brain hasn't realized you're awake, you're paralyzed, and you see entities at the bottom of the bed, or not always aliens, but also any sort of weird entity, really. But I suppose nowadays people are more likely to see alien entities. But like I said before, that doesn't explain a lot of abduction cases where people say they've actually gone in a craft and then they've found themselves, say, locked outside their own home, or they wake up with muddy feet, and so showing that they'd actually gone outside. But I think the problem there is sometimes people have said they've had these alien experiences, but the person in the bed with them has said, we didn't actually go anywhere. And another factor is people can do quite a lot of strange things, sleepwalking. There's even been cases of people murdering people in their sleep. Pretty rare thing, thankfully. But I think, people's abilities can be quite extreme, really, and that we can do strange things in their sleep. Sleepwalking, and also people can get into fugue states, which I think might explain some cases of abduction as well. And I remember reading quite a few stories of like a lady who had these alien abduction experiences when she stopped her vehicle and then had missing time, and you wonder if she went into some sort of alternative state of consciousness. And it'd be interesting to know if she actually did physically go anywhere and was physically abducted, or whether it was all in her mind. But I suppose there again, people would argue that aliens can manipulate human minds, that they can. So even if you're not physically being abducted, you could be psychologically forced to feel like you had been abducted. So I think that's the thing, though. I think you can get knotted up with all these different hypotheses, but if you read a lot of UFO books, they don't really put forward other ideas, really. And like with my book, I've tried to actually include alternative ideas where people can look to look up these theories, really, or to look at other evidence. And I think that's the thing with a lot of UFO books, especially abduction ones, that want to promote one viewpoint of that subject, and we kind of dismiss any alternative ideas. And I suppose it's difficult, really, because then the experiencer can become the piggy in the middle. Like if you've got a skeptic saying, "Oh, it's all a load of rubbish, it's all in your mind," and then you've got a believer saying, "No, it's aliens, and we're trying to breed breed new generations of you to live, God knows where. But the thing is, so I think that's from an ethical point of view, it's difficult to steer a decent course. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've given pseudonyms to some of the people in the book. One of them did say he didn't mind having his name published, but I thought for his own protection, really, it was better, and he kind of agreed with me, which does make it more difficult having pseudonyms and people who don't want to be photographed or anything. But I think you've got to respect the fact that if you're going to report these kind of experiences, I think we need a certain amount of protection. And it's like with my book, I think people can just simply think, oh, we're all mad, and ridicule the people in it. So I think there's actually a comment somewhere, I forget where it is now, but somebody said, oh, I'd wasted 50 years of my life investigating UFOs. That was an embarrassment to listen to, crazy people with their crazy stories. So I think sometimes I think we're right, but in a way, it's such a dismissive attitude. And I think, that's a sort of enemy of a subject.
Yeah, personally, I think there's a lot of worse ways that you could spend your life. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. But I did want to tell you that I really did thoroughly enjoy reading your book, Portraits of Alien Encounters Revisited. Your level-headed perspective was refreshing. It was a really good read. I recommend that everybody check it out, and I'll have a link to that in the description of this podcast. Nigel, would you like to tell the audience where they can learn more about your work?
If you look on Facebook, you can look me up, just put my name on there, so Nigel Watson or Nigel Watson UFO. I've also got a UFO investigations page on Facebook, and I think if you type in UFO investigations, it'll come up with my page, because I kind of update it with any things like any new podcasts or links to newspaper reports about my research or any sort of relevant UFO news, really. But if you kind of Google my name and UFO, you should find a few links.
Excellent. Well, we'll include links to those sources down in our description as well for the audience to use. Thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for talking to me.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you again next time.